Hello. So in this video, we're going to talk about Book 6 of Plato's Republic. So Book 6 picks up from the end of Book 5 with the discussion of philosopher kings and the notion of what makes a philosopher a philosopher. So Socrates defines a philosopher essentially as, since those who are able to grasp what is always the same in all respects are philosophers, while those who are not able to do so, and who wander among many things that vary in every sort of way, are not philosophers, which of the two should be the leaders in a city? So this is essentially what Socrates defines a philosopher as. And we saw this at the end of Book 5, this idea that a philosopher is a lover of the true forms of things, or the essence of a thing. A philosopher is interested not in what objects are beautiful, but in what does beauty mean. For instance, what does truth mean? What does justice mean? Which is the central question of the Republic. And so the virtues of a philosopher, according to Socrates, are a love of truth, a love of knowledge, and a devotion above any other concern, even life itself, with truth and knowledge. And so this is the first bit of Book 6, is this sort of rehashing of what it means to be a philosopher for Socrates, recovering these things that were covered at the end of Book 5. And Socrates says here, "Is there any objection you can find, then, to a way of life that no one can adequately follow unless he is by nature good at remembering, quick to learn, high-minded, graceful, and a friend and relative of truth, justice, courage, and moderation?" And I think this is Glaucon, who says not even Momus could find one. Momus, according to the footnote here, is a personification of blame or censure. And Socrates says, when such people have reached maturity in age and education, wouldn't you entrust the city to them and to them alone? So again, this is his argument for philosopher kings, that they are going to do the best job ruling a city. But Adeimantus challenges him on this point. He says, "For someone might well say now that he's unable to oppose you as you ask each of your questions, yet he sees that all of those who take up philosophy, not those who merely dabble in it while still young in order to complete their upbringing and then drop it, but those who continue it for a longer time, the greatest number become cranks, not to say completely vicious, while those who seem completely decent are rendered useless to the city because of the way of life you recommend." Socrates then says, "When I'd heard him out, I said, do you think that what these people say is false?" Adeimantus says, "I don't know, but I'd be glad to hear what you think." And Socrates says, "You'd hear that they seem to me to speak the truth." So basically, Socrates agrees with the critique that Adeimantus poses about philosophers. Most of them suck. Most of them are terrible people who are vicious and unreliable. Those who are not terrible people are useless. They're unable to effect actual change or action in the world. And Socrates agrees with this. He then goes on to make an argument distinguishing true philosophers from all of the others, the majority of people that claim to be or are seen as philosophers. Essentially, this is a variation of the no true Scotsman fallacy, because Socrates is here saying only the philosophers that meet my specific and limited set of criteria count as actual philosophers. Everybody else is not a true philosopher. So the no true Scotsman fallacy is a logical fallacy. It's a problematic approach to argumentation because it depends on setting criteria that may or may not be objectively required for a particular category. So Socrates establishes his criteria. Again, they all sort of connect with this idea of deep and unrestrained love of wisdom, courage, moderation, justice, etc., etc. The same sorts of values that belong to the proper city-state, and he's talked about this in previous books. He acknowledges that the true philosopher is incredibly rare and must be carefully nurtured with the right education and under the right constitution, the right city constitution. As one of the things Socrates says here is that part of the reason that true philosophers are largely ineffective is because he didn't chance upon a constitution that suits him. Under a suitable one, his own growth would be fuller, and he'll save the community as well as himself. And his interlocutor, which is at this point still Adeimantus, says, "Which of our present constitutions do you think is suitable for philosophers?" And Socrates says, "None of them. That's exactly my complaint. None of our present constitutions is worthy of the philosophic nature, and as a result, this nature is perverted and altered, for just as a foreign seed sown in alien ground is likely to be overcome by the native species and to fade away among them, so the philosophic nature fails to develop its full power and declines into a different character. But if it were to find the best constitution, as it is itself the best, it would be clear that it is really divine and that other natures and ways of life are merely human." So essentially, Socrates says that the reason philosophers can't get anything done is because they don't have the constitution, the city constitution, that would encourage them to flourish and to save the entirety of the city. The question arises, is the constitution of the Callipolis that they have been discussing the constitution that would be needed in order for philosopher kings to really rise? And Socrates essentially sort of hedges here a little bit, because on the one hand he says basically yes, you would need the constitution of the Callipolis in order for this to take place, but he also seems to believe that through kings becoming more philosophical, or through philosophers taking a more prominent role in society, that can create the ideal constitution. Toward the end of Book 6, Socrates takes up the question of what is the good. And he doesn't really want to take this up, in part because, again, the central question of the Republic is about justice. But one of the things he asserts is that the true philosopher should primarily be concerned with the good, with discovering the good. And he says the form of the good is the most important thing to learn about, and that it's by their relation to it that just things and the other things become useful and beneficial. So he argues that by pursuing the good, the form of the good, or the essence or truth of the good as such, that philosophers move toward real, genuine understandings of things like justice, moderation, courage, etc., and these other values. Now, Socrates is challenged to define the good, which he refuses to even attempt to do, which we've seen before. I think it's in Book 2, where Thrasymachus challenges Socrates to define justice, and Socrates is like, "Oh, I don't know anything about what justice might be." And Thrasymachus is like, "Yeah, I called it. I knew if I challenged you directly, you were just going to be ironic about this." So we got that. Socrates is again playing that game that he plays here. But he does give a simile. He gives an analogy. And the analogy is with the sun. So he says that when we look at something, we have our eyes that perceive, we have the thing that's being perceived, but the third element is the sunlight. We need sunlight in order to see. And if we don't have the sunlight, it's as though we are blind. And essentially this is, he makes the argument that the sun is to our eyes, or to seeing, as the good is to our souls. So the good is what allows us to see and understand virtues, in the way that the sunlight is what allows us to see and understand objects. And he says here, so that what gives truth to the things known and the power to know to the knower is the form of the good. And though it is the cause of knowledge and truth, it is also an object of knowledge. Both knowledge and truth are beautiful things, but the good is other and more beautiful than they. So the good is above the other things that are valuable in the world, above beauty, above truth, etc., etc., because the good is what allows those things to be comprehensible. And that's where he leaves off book 6, is essentially with this question of good, and the idea that the philosopher, the proper philosopher in Socrates' view, is largely focused on pursuing the good as such.